Hey everyone, welcome back to Medieval Historian. Let me ask you something. Have you ever stubbed your toe so hard you had to sit down and catch your breath? Or woken up in the night with a cramp that made you groan through clenched teeth? Now imagine that feeling not as a sudden accident, but as something planned, expected, delivered by someone else's hand. Not once, not twice, but again and again, with tools made for no other purpose than to pull pain out of the human body like smoke from a fire. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere cold, somewhere dark. You're standing in a stone room beneath a castle or cathedral, a space that never sees sunlight. The air is heavy with damp, and it smells like iron and old blood. On one side of the room, a brazier burns low, casting flickers of light on chains bolted to the wall. There's a rack along the far wall, and beside it, a small wooden table with tools laid out in perfect order. Some look like tongs, some like pears. None of them are meant to comfort. And in this world, comfort was not the point. You see, in the modern world, when we think of punishment, we imagine time, a sentence, a number of years. But in the Middle Ages, punishment was something you felt, not just physically, but publicly, spiritually, and deeply. Pain was used to prove guilt, to purge sin, to entertain crowds, to warn others. Torture wasn't just about hurting someone. It was about reminding everyone else what happened if you stepped outside the bounds of what your village, your king, or your god allowed. In today's video, we're walking through that dungeon. Not just the stones and the fire and the iron, but the minds of the people who believed this was necessary. We're going to look at the devices, the rituals, the laws, and the beliefs that made medieval torture a part of everyday life. It wasn't just monsters in dungeons. It was magistrates, clerics, neighbors, sometimes even family. Before we begin, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next descent into the past. And tell me in the comments what city and country are you watching from? And what time is it right now where you are? I say this every time, but I mean it. I love seeing history lovers from all over the world joining together like this. You make this journey even more fascinating. So find a warm blanket, settle in somewhere safe, and let the fire in the dungeon burn low. We're not here to rush. This isn't the gruesome practices of torture in the Middle Ages. Pain in the Middle Ages was not simply an unfortunate experience or an inconvenience. It was a tool, a message, sometimes even a blessing. People believed that the human body, frail and corruptible, was a mirror of the soul, and that what happened to the flesh could shape what lay beneath. A body marked by pain could be a soul cleansed of sin. A man who suffered publicly might find not only forgiveness, but honor, at least in the eyes of his God and his community. To us, that might sound twisted, but to them, it was theology wrapped in practice. The church taught that the world was soaked in sin. Ever since Adam's fall, the flesh had been weak, deceitful, and prone to wickedness. Pain was not the enemy. It was the consequence, the discipline, the path back to purity. Just as a blacksmith tempers iron in flame, so too did God temper his people through suffering. In sermons and scripture, stories of saints told of beatings, whippings, and martyrdoms accepted with serenity. Some saints even welcomed it. Their pain was proof that they were worthy. And ordinary people, watching from the muddy edges of life, learned to see pain as not only inevitable, but divine. If a person sinned, they had to confess. But confession meant more than words. It meant penance, a pilgrimage, a fast, a scourging. Some walked barefoot across miles of stone. Some wore hair shirts or iron bands beneath their robes, scratching their skin raw in quiet torment. The body was the vessel of atonement. The more pain it endured, the cleaner the soul became. This was not sadism. It was salvation, packaged in flesh and fear. Torture, then, became a natural extension of this worldview. If you were accused of heresy, If you whispered doctrines that defied the church or questioned the king's divine right, you were not just a criminal, you were a disease, and pain was the cure. If a person confessed only under torment, that was not a contradiction, it was clarity. Pain brought truth to the surface, stripping away lies like bark from a tree. The innocent had nothing to fear, the church said. God would protect them. And if they broke, well, perhaps their confession had saved their soul after all. This belief wasn't confined to monks or priests. It filtered down into the courts, into village councils, into family homes. Parents disciplined their children with straps and rods, believing that obedience grew best in pain's shadow. Husbands ruled their households with force. Entire communities gathered to watch beatings and executions, not out of cruelty, but out of conviction. To witness pain was to remember the cost of straying, and to inflict pain, under law or scripture, was to serve something larger than the self. It is difficult to understand now, when we value the absence of pain as a marker of progress. We numb it, suppress it, fight it with pills and therapy. But in the medieval world, pain was information. It was proof. It meant that God was present. It meant that justice was unfolding, even if the result was a body broken on the wheel or a woman burned at the stake. Without pain, there was no learning. Without pain, there could be no order. This mindset also explained why punishments were so often public. A whipping done in private was meaningless, but a whipping in the square, with every eye watching and every breath held, carried weight. The punished person was made an example, not just of guilt, but of divine reckoning. And those who watched were not just spectators. They were witnesses to a sacred drama, one in which the body became the stage and suffering played the lead. In monasteries, monks sometimes inflicted pain upon themselves, not for crimes, but for thoughts. A lustful glance, an impure dream, even pride in a well-formed prayer could earn a flogging. The discipline was not meant to destroy, but to refine. The lash became a prayer in motion, a physical confession, a sacrifice to silence the ego and open the soul to humility. Pain was currency, and the more one spent, the richer the spirit might become. Of course, not everyone believed in this system. There were murmurs, doubts, moments when even the most faithful questioned what they saw. A child screaming under a rod, a neighbor dragged from his home, accused of whispering strange ideas, a woman tied to a post while fire licked at her feet. Some people turned away, some wept, but the structure remained. The philosophy of pain was so deeply woven into the world that to unravel it would be to question everything: faith, law, justice, even God himself. So when we begin to explore torture as it was practiced, with racks and irons and ropes, we cannot treat it as merely violence. We have to understand the why. The people who turned the wheels and tightened the screws believed they were acting out a truth that transcended the flesh. They were not only punishing the body, they were redeeming the soul, or defending the faith, or protecting the village from corruption. It was an ugly mercy, or so they believed, and it shaped centuries of law, ritual, and power. In this world, pain was not failure. Pain was proof that the system worked, and whether you were innocent, guilty, or somewhere in between, the ache in your bones was a whisper from heaven. Or so they told themselves, over and over, until the blood dried and the screams faded into silence. Before the elaborate contraptions of torture chambers, before the iron wheels and wooden racks, before pain was engineered with ropes and cranks, there was something even older, something more elemental: trial by ordeal. To us, it sounds more like superstition than law, but for centuries it was the test by which truth was revealed. Before confessions were pulled from the mouth by force, they were coaxed from the body through fire, water, or combat, all in the belief that God would not allow the innocent to suffer. It was not evidence or reason that determined guilt. It was divine judgment, expressed through agony. Imagine being accused of a crime you did not commit. Perhaps someone claimed you stole from the church, or whispered heresy under your breath, or poisoned your neighbor's well. The villagers are stirred, the priest is summoned, and the elders decide the matter must be settled by ordeal. This is no trial in the modern sense. There is no defense attorney, no cross-examination, no weighing of facts. The truth, they say, lies in the hands of heaven. All they need to do is put you in a position where your body can speak what your words cannot. One of the most common ordeals was by fire. In some versions, you were made to carry a piece of red-hot iron a certain number of paces. In others, you plunged your hand into a pot of boiling water to retrieve a stone resting at the bottom. The logic was simple. If God protected you, your wound would heal cleanly within a few days. If it blistered, festered, or refused to scab, you were guilty. The heat itself wasn't the punishment, it was the messenger. And every burned hand was treated like scripture, read and interpreted by priests who believed they were watching God's will unfold in bruises and boils. There was also ordeal by water, though it came in two forms, cold water and hot. The hot version was much like the iron test, relying on scalds and healing times. The cold water test, however, worked in reverse. A person was bound and lowered into a body of water, sometimes a pond, sometimes a river. If they sank, they were innocent. If they floated, they were guilty. Floating, it was believed, meant that the water rejected them, refused to accept the sin that clung to their soul. Drowning meant purity. Death could prove your innocence, but of course by then, it hardly mattered. Women accused of witchcraft often faced this test. Villagers would watch as a suspected witch was tied at the ankles and wrists, her dress ballooning around her as she hit the surface. A priest might stand nearby, praying under his breath, while others watched in silence. If she sank, her family could bury her with honor. If she floated, she was pulled out and punished accordingly, sometimes tortured, sometimes burned. In either case, the ordeal was seen as just. The people who watched did not consider themselves cruel. They believed they were witnesses to divine judgment, the same way a congregation might watch a baptism or a burial. It was ceremony, not vengeance. At least, that's what they told themselves. There were also trials by combat. These were more common among the nobility, though not exclusive to them. Two men would face off, each claiming righteousness, each invoking God to favor the one who spoke truth. The duel could be to first blood or to the death, depending on the stakes. A widow might hire a champion to fight on her behalf if she could not defend herself. A priest might preside over the match, blessing the weapons, even though the outcome would be brutal. Victory was taken as proof of innocence. Wounds or death signaled guilt. God was always watching, always choosing. The ordeal was not always violent. In some cases, it took the form of oaths. A person might be asked to swear before God, with their neighbors called as character witnesses. If they faltered, or if enough people refused to support their claim, they were deemed untrustworthy. But even then, pain was never far away. A broken oath could lead to punishment. Doubt could lead to a new ordeal, more painful than the last. Trust was fragile, and fear made it weaker. What made these ordeals so terrifying was their unpredictability. You could be completely innocent and still find yourself with skin blistered to the bone. You could sink in the water and never surface again. You could enter combat and lose because your opponent was stronger, not more righteous. Yet none of that mattered. The outcome was interpreted not by logic, but by belief. Those watching were not waiting for fairness. They were waiting for a sign. It is hard to know how many truly believed in the justice of ordeal, and how many simply feared being the one who doubted. In a world where heresy could mean the stake, suspicion was a dangerous luxury. People accepted the ordeal because it fit into the structure of their lives. The same church that baptized their children also boiled their hands. The The same priests who prayed for the sick also declared the guilty. It was all of a piece, and for those in power, the ordeal offered an easy way to resolve conflict without responsibility. If the fire judged you guilty, then it was not the judge who condemned you, it was God. Eventually, the church began to move away from trials by ordeal. By the 13th century, papal decrees forbade priests from participating. This shift came not out of newfound compassion, but because the outcomes were unreliable. Too many people suffered without confession. Too many floated who were not witches. Too many died with their innocence still in question. Logic began to seep into law, and the church grew wary of divine signs that could not be trusted. In their place came more structured forms of interrogation, and with them, more elaborate forms of pain. But for a time, these trials were everything. They were the justice system, the moral compass, the hand of heaven made visible. And though we might scoff at the idea now, to those who lived under it, the ordeal was real. It was terrifying, yes. It was unfair, yes. But it was also familiar. And in a world full of storms and plagues and unexplainable suffering, at least this kind of pain had a purpose. It meant something. So before the dungeon, before the iron, before the scream pulled from the throat by calculated cruelty, there was fire and water and combat. There was a belief that pain, in the right form, could reveal the soul's deepest truth, and that in the balance between life and death, the hand of God could still be seen. The rack was not the first torture device ever used, but it may be the one that best captures what medieval punishment became when pain was stripped of symbolism and given mechanics. Where earlier ordeals relied on divine judgment, the rack relied on human hands and ropes and the slow turn of a wheel. It was not about seeing if God would intervene, it was about making a person scream, not just from pain, but from the deep, primal rupture of their own body rebelling against itself. Picture a simple wooden frame, not much different in shape from a table. One end fixed, the other fitted with rollers turned by hand cranks. Across the frame lay a person, wrists bound with rope to the top, ankles tied to the bottom. As the rollers turned, the ropes grew taut, pulling the limbs in opposite directions. At first it felt like an uncomfortable stretch, then a tightness across the shoulders and hips, then a pulling in the joints that could no longer be ignored. And then came the shift, the deep grind of sockets sliding, ligaments tearing, the sudden space between bones where no space should exist. People did not scream immediately. Most tried to stay silent. It was common, after all, for a victim to be told the rack would be used unless they spoke. Many gave in before the ropes were even pulled, but those who resisted, or who had nothing to confess, learned that the silence could only last so long. Eventually, the body reaches a point where it will speak without permission. It does not whisper. It roars. Joints separate, muscles rip, nerves scream without words. No matter how strong your will, no matter how deep your conviction, the body has its own threshold. The rack finds it every time. Torturers were not always brutes. Some saw themselves as professionals. They learned the anatomy of pain. They knew which movements caused maximum damage and which left the body mostly intact. In many cases, the goal was not to kill. A dead prisoner could not confess. A broken one could. So the wheel was turned slowly, just enough to make the prisoner feel the stretch, the slow unraveling of their limbs, the sensation that their arms were no longer connected to their torso in any familiar way. Then it was paused. Questions were asked. Names were demanded. If nothing came, the wheel turned again. It is easy to imagine this happening in a dark cellar, but many racks were kept in visible spaces, sometimes even near courtrooms. The threat was part of the trial. Judges might order someone to be shown the device, to be laid upon it, to feel the ropes tighten just enough to hint at what was coming. A performance, but not a false one. People confessed out of fear, out of pain, out of desperation to keep their limbs attached. Some told the truth, some lied just to make it stop. The damage inflicted by the rack did not end when the wheels stopped turning. Shoulders that were dislocated often remained so for life. Tendons could not always heal. Muscles snapped under pressure did not always regain function. Some victims lost the ability to walk. Others dragged limbs behind them. A few lived with arms that hung lower than they once had, stretched beyond their normal length by inches. The body did not forget. Neither did the people who saw them afterward. Survivors became living proof of what silence could cost. In England, the rack was called the Duke of Exeter's daughter, named after a nobleman who allegedly introduced it. In France, it was known simply as the ladder. The names varied, but the purpose never did. It was used during the Inquisition, during civil disputes, during investigations of treason, theft, heresy. Anyone could face it if the court believed pain might produce answers. Women were not exempt. Neither were children. There are accounts of people fainting from the strain, not from a blow or a strike, but simply from being pulled so far apart that the body could no longer remain conscious. Blood vessels ruptured. Breathing became difficult. Some people bit their tongues or screamed until their throats bled. Others endured in silence, not because they were stronger, but because the pain had pulled them past speech, a place where the body still lived but the voice had already left. And yet, despite its horror, the rack was not considered cruel by the standards of its time. It was seen as a necessary tool, a way to separate lies from truth, defiance from confession. A person who held out under the rack was either deeply guilty or deeply protected by some other force. No one left it as they arrived. Even the torturer often changed, sometimes visibly shaken, sometimes proud of his efficiency. Either way, the ritual had done its work. In some cases, a confession obtained on the rack was not even used as evidence. Instead, it was a way to push the accused to a public admission. The confession might be repeated in court, under duress but stated aloud. It was a form of theater, but one in which the stakes were agony and the script written in advance. Those watching rarely doubted the guilt of someone who had been stretched to the edge of breaking and finally said yes to the question that would make it stop. There were, of course, false confessions. People admitted to crimes they had not committed, accused others simply to ease their own suffering. The ripple effect of a single rack session could destroy families, villages, entire communities. Fear spread faster than the truth, and still, the wheel turned. Eventually, the use of the rack faded. Laws changed, courts began to require more evidence, and public opinion shifted. But in its time, the rack was more than a tool. It was a symbol of authority, of fear, of what could be done to a body that resisted. And though the wood rotted and the ropes were discarded, the stories remained. Today, the idea of such a device seems unthinkable. But the rack teaches us something about the way power and belief can shape the tools we build. It shows how quickly justice can turn into cruelty when pain becomes an acceptable method of persuasion, and it reminds us that silence is not always a choice. Sometimes, it is all that is left when the body can no longer carry the weight of what it knows. Torture in the Middle Ages was not always about blood. It was not always about screams echoing from stone walls or flesh torn by iron. Sometimes, it was slower, quieter, and designed to last. Sometimes, it looked like justice, but felt like shame. Not all pain came from the rack or the stake. Some of it came from how you were seen, how long you were made to stand, what you were made to wear, what they made you feel when they stared. The simplest tools were often the most effective. A heavy chain bolted to a wall, an iron collar that locked around the neck. These weren't complicated devices. They didn't need to be. Their power came from endurance. The weight pressing on the body hour after hour, the inability to sit or lie down, the humiliation of being displayed like a stray dog. It wasn't about making someone scream. It was about making them endure, making them feel like their body no longer belonged to them, and their time was no longer theirs to measure. The iron collar was used not only in dungeons, but in village squares and near church doors. Offenders were fastened in place for everyone to see. A thief might spend hours locked upright in the cold, his neck stiff, his arms bound behind him. A woman accused of gossip might be chained outside her own home, so every neighbor could pass by and judge her. There was no crowd cheering or jeering, just the slow erosion of dignity as the world moved around you and refused to look away. Or worse, refused to care. The pillory was another form of restraint. It held a person's head and hands in place, bent forward, unable to move. Unlike the stocks, which bound the feet, the pillory was made for spectacle. People passing by could see your face, your expression. Some would throw food, rotten vegetables, dung, whatever they had. Some would spit, others simply stared. The goal was humiliation, not necessarily injury. But humiliation could cut deeper than whips when it came from familiar faces. And then there was the cucking stool, sometimes called the ducking stool. It was used mostly on women, often for so-called moral offenses. A woman labeled a scold, or accused of adultery, or suspected of being disruptive, might find herself tied to a wooden chair mounted on long beams. The stool would be lowered into water, slowly, or with a sudden splash, then raised again. She would cough and gasp and drip and choke, then be dunked once more. It was not meant to kill, only to punish, to soak the pride out of a person until they sat shivering in their own shame. What made the cucking stool so effective was its setting. These punishments happened in full view of the village, the riverbank, the square, the churchyard. These were the places where people gathered, where life unfolded. To be punished, there was to be stripped of privacy, of protection. You were not just cold and wet and bound, you were watched. And the eyes of your neighbors could be as sharp as any blade. Many of the people subjected to these punishments were not hardened criminals. They were people who spoke out of turn, or refused to obey, or were simply disliked. A woman who challenged her husband, a man who mocked a local official, a poor tenant who missed a rent payment and answered back. These tools, these devices, were not only about law, they were about order, about enforcing roles. They made examples of those who were seen as disruptive, not by breaking their bones, but by breaking their standing in the eyes of the community. There were variations. Some collars had bells attached, so the punished could be heard even before they were seen. Some cucking stools were designed to roll through the streets like a cart, carrying the accused from door to door while townsfolk lined the route. It was not enough to be punished. You had to be paraded. You had to be seen, remembered, pointed at. That was the true sentence. This kind of punishment left no scars, at least none visible. The body might recover in a day. The bruises might fade within a week. But the damage to one's place in the world, that could linger for years. People remembered, they whispered, they avoided, they laughed. The humiliation was not momentary. It followed like a shadow, like the cold memory of water soaking your skin while your children watched. Some communities even used public shaming as a kind of routine discipline. Regular offenders would be assigned hours in the collar or time in the pillory the way we assign fines or service hours today. It became part of the rhythm of village life. Market days, sermons, punishments, each a kind of ritual, each with its own audience. And yet, within all this, there was something disturbingly familiar. The impulse to shame, to expose, to reduce someone to an object of ridicule did not disappear with the Middle Ages. It only changed shape. What once happened in the square now happens in headlines. What was once whispered behind hands is now typed and shared. The collar is gone, but its spirit lingers. We still measure guilt by spectacle. We still think that being seen in pain is proof of wrongdoing. In the Middle Ages, punishment didn't need to draw blood to leave a mark. A simple band of iron, a chair on a riverbank, a crowd with no sympathy. These were enough. Because pain doesn't always come with a scream. Sometimes it comes with silence. Sometimes it comes from being made to sit still while the world looks on and chooses not to help. The Iron Maiden is one of the most iconic torture devices in the popular imagination. A tall, human-shaped sarcophagus lined with sharp metal spikes. The victim placed inside, the door slowly closed, and the body pierced in a dozen places at once, not enough to kill immediately, but enough to bleed and stab without escape. The image is unforgettable. It appears in horror films, on the pages of grim history books, and in the hushed tones of guided tours through old castles and dungeons. But here is the strange truth. The Iron Maiden, as we picture it, likely never existed in the Middle Ages. There are no reliable records of Iron Maidens being used during the medieval period. No trial transcripts, no eyewitness accounts, no inventory lists from castles or courts. What we have are later inventions, 19th century museum pieces built to shock and fascinate, often pieced together from parts of unrelated artifacts. The most famous example, the so-called Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, appeared in the late 1700s, long after the supposed era of its use. It was displayed not as evidence of justice, but as a curiosity, an echo of a past imagined darker than it truly was. This does not mean medieval torture was gentle. Far from it. But the Iron Maiden belongs more to the world of Gothic fiction than to the dusty courtrooms of the 13th century. It served a different kind of purpose, not the extraction of confession or the delivery of punishment, but the preservation of fear. People needed to believe that there had once been a device so terrible, so merciless, that simply imagining it made your chest tighten. The maiden became a symbol, a figure cloaked in steel, the embodiment of judgment with no room for plea or mercy. The idea of enclosing a person in a tight, inescapable space is not new, however. Spiked coffins, standing cages, and other forms of confinement did exist. Some were used to display the bodies of the dead, others held the living. These cages, made of iron bars or wood reinforced with nails, were designed to hold the body upright, sometimes for days. Movement was limited to a sway, a tilt of the head. There was no sitting, no lying down. The victims stood until their legs failed, until their breath grew shallow, until exhaustion pulled them toward unconsciousness. Spiked variants were more rare. Some cages were lined with blunt or sharp protrusions, not designed to pierce deeply but to press, to bruise, to make stillness painful and motion worse. The goal was not execution but degradation, exposure to the elements, to animals, to the eyes of the public. To be locked in a cage like that was to become a thing to be observed, studied, judged, and eventually forgotten. You did not need spikes for that kind of torment, just time and silence. Whether or not a device matched the legend of the Iron Maiden, the fear it created was real. Even rumors could break a person. A whisper that someone had seen such a device. A tale told by candlelight about a man who never came back after being taken to the castle. A child warned not to lie or steal, lest the maiden take them in the night. Fear filled in the spaces history left blank. And in those spaces, people imagined metal women who never wept and always punished. The power of the Iron Maiden lies not in its reality, but in its construction as myth. It is a story we tell ourselves about what we think the past was like. It allows us to feel shocked, horrified, even superior. We can look back and say, how barbaric, how cruel, how impossible. But cruelty does not need sharp steel to exist. It needs belief. It needs ritual. It needs a system that turns pain into a message and suffering into spectacle. In truth, many of the worst tortures in the medieval world were not elaborate. They were simple. ropes, knives, cages, chains, a boot tightened around a leg, a thumb crushed between stones. A person kept awake until madness set in. These required no fantasy, no towering iron maiden waiting in the dark. They happened in rooms lit by candles and watched by scribes who recorded every scream. And yet, we remember the maiden more vividly, perhaps because it gives shape to something we cannot easily face. We are drawn to the image of the Iron Maiden because it wears the disguise of civilization. It is clean, symmetrical, deliberate. Not wild like the rack or chaotic like fire. It is pain with a closed mouth. A punishment that does not shout but waits. That waiting is what unnerves us most. The idea that you could be locked in a steel body, a mimic of your own form, and left to feel the press of judgment on every part of you. Alone, upright, forgotten. And perhaps that was the point of the myth. Not to record an actual tool of torture, but to warn us about what happens when justice becomes theater, when fear becomes tradition. The maiden is not a relic of the past, but a mirror we hold to our own fears. It reminds us how easily the line between justice and cruelty can blur when people are convinced they are doing what is necessary. So whether she existed or not, the Iron Maiden lingers. Not in the museums that house her false frame, but in the stories we continue to tell. She is a shadow that walks with history, a symbol more enduring than steel. And though the door may never have closed on a real human heart, the idea that it could was enough to leave its mark. There is something ancient about skin. It is the first thing we see when we look at one another. It holds our shape, contains our warmth, marks us with age, color, scars, and identity. To touch another person's skin is intimate. To wound it is personal. To remove it, slowly and deliberately, is something else entirely. In the Middle Ages, flaying was a punishment reserved for the most serious offenses, not because it was the most effective, not because it revealed truth or saved souls, but because it stripped a person not just of life, but of humanity. It turned a body into an object, a symbol, a warning. Flaying was most often used in cases of treason, the betrayal of a king, the turning of arms against a lord, the desecration of sacred law. These were not crimes handled in silence or in shadows. They were public offenses and demanded public spectacle. Executions alone were sometimes not enough. Death could come too quickly. What the authorities wanted was memory, a punishment that would echo in the minds of those who watched. Flaying achieved that in ways few other methods could. The process began with the body restrained, often in full view of a crowd. The condemned was stripped of clothing and dignity alike. The skin, still living, still feeling, was cut with small, practiced strokes. The torturer was not always in a hurry. The goal was not only pain but control. Skin peeled back in layers, sometimes from the chest, sometimes from the arms. Sometimes the face itself was the first to be opened. Blood flowed, but not enough to kill, not at first. That was part of the design. Death would come eventually, but only after the nerves had screamed for long enough to satisfy the sentence. There are records, though few, that describe flaying in brutal detail. In some cases, the skin of the traitor was displayed after death, stretched and nailed to the gates of the city or the doors of the castle. It was a way to say, this man did not just die, he was unmade. This was not just about punishment, it was about permanence. Words could be forgotten, but a patch of human skin, tanned like leather and waving in the wind, could speak without a tongue. One of the most well-known cases comes from England, where a man named William de Morisco was executed for treason in the 13th century. After being drawn and hanged, his body was flayed and quartered. His skin was nailed to the door of Westminster Hall. For years afterward, it remained there. No plaque, no explanation, just a warning in flesh, a silent scream hammered into wood. In other regions, Flaying was reserved for crimes against the divine. Some who insulted the church or defiled relics were punished in this way. In rare cases, those suspected of sorcery or consorting with demons met the same fate. The body was seen as a vessel for sin, and to remove the skin was to open that vessel, to expose what lay beneath. The soul, perhaps, or the rot that had corrupted it. The process was as much performance as punishment. A skilled flayer could keep a person alive through much of the procedure. Cuts were made with precision, muscles revealed in strips. The flesh beneath shivered with every breath. The pain was unimaginable, yet it had its own rhythm. Crowds sometimes gathered to witness it, not with cheer, but with the same stillness that follows thunder. Horror, fascination, disbelief, and sometimes approval. They had come not to see blood. They had come to see justice. Even after death, the use of flaying continued. Corpses of executed traitors were sometimes skinned and displayed. In these cases, pain was no longer the point. The message remained. It was a way of saying this person was not only removed from the living, but denied dignity in death. The skin was treated not as part of a man, but as material. It could be preserved, displayed, studied. In some places, it was used to bind books of law, a cruel irony that did not go unnoticed. The symbolism of skin runs deep. In religious texts, skin often represents separation, boundary, vulnerability. To be flayed was to be open to judgment, to exposure. In ancient rituals, the removal of skin could mark rebirth or sacrifice. But in medieval justice, it was a statement of control. The state, the church, the ruler, had the right to determine not only if you lived or died, but how your body was remembered or erased. Flaying was rare, but its rarity gave it power. Most people would never see it in person, only hear the stories whispered in dark corners. A merchant who spoke against the king, a noblewoman who was caught in a conspiracy, a thief who had dared to steal from the cathedral. Were all of the stories true? Probably not. But truth was not required. The fear was enough. The image alone was enough to keep tongues still and knees bent. There is a painting from the Renaissance, centuries after the height of these practices, that shows Saint Bartholomew holding his own skin like a cloak. In one version, the flayed skin has a face, looking back at the saint who wears it. The image is both sacred and disturbing. It reminds the viewer that skin is not the soul, that the body can be punished and peeled and desecrated, but the spirit may still endure. That was the hope, at least, for those who watched or who feared that fate for themselves. But for most, flaying was not about faith. It was about order. It was about the thin line between power and rebellion. It was a reminder that some bodies could be turned inside out to preserve the smooth exterior of the kingdom. You could lose your name, your family, your life, and still the sentence would not be over until the last inch of skin was gone. In time, the practice fell out of favor. It was too slow, too brutal, too visible. The law turned to other forms of execution, quicker, cleaner, less likely to cause unrest. But flaying left its mark. It entered folklore, nightmares, poems. It became the punishment reserved for the worst sins, even in imagination. And even now, the idea of it pulls something deep and primal from us, a shiver that runs just beneath the skin, where fear lives, where memory lingers, where the edge of cruelty begins. In the dim corners of history's imagination sits a device small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, but heavy with rumor and dread. It does not look like much at first. A metal flower of sorts, made of 4 curved petals with a hinge at one end and a screw at the other, cold, quiet, and precise. It is called the pear of anguish. Its name comes not from the fruit it vaguely resembles, but from the pain it was said to deliver. The purpose of the device was not to cut, not to tear, not even to kill. It was made to open, slowly, from the inside, The pear would be inserted into the mouth, or sometimes the rectum or the vagina, depending on the nature of the accusation. Once inside, a screw mechanism would be turned, causing the metal arms to spread apart. Not rapidly, not explosively, just enough, a little at a time, until the tissue stretched, the bones gave way, the silence shattered. The stories say it was used to punish blasphemers, liars, and women accused of promiscuity or abortion. Others claim it was reserved for witches, heretics, and those who dared speak against authority. The mouth was a dangerous thing in the Middle Ages. It could confess or deny, pray or curse, sing or scream. It could carry ideas that questioned the church or the king. So to silence it with pain was not just punishment. It was a message that words had consequences, that speech could be answered with steel. There are few confirmed records of the pear being used during actual interrogations. Most surviving examples date from later centuries, and some historians believe they may have been symbolic, ceremonial, or even fabricated entirely for display. Still, their design alone suggests an understanding of anatomy, of how pain can be applied where it cannot be easily resisted. Once the pear was inside, there was no way to remove it without help. And once it began to open, the victim had no leverage, no position, no defense, only the scream. The mouth was the most common sight. It made sense. If someone had spoken lies or insults or heresy, the same mouth would receive judgment. Teeth could crack under the pressure. Jaws could be dislocated. The muscles that control speech could tear. A voice silenced not by cutting the tongue, but by destroying the space in which it moved. There are accounts, though rare, of survivors left unable to speak, their faces twisted permanently, their jaws misshapen, a sentence that never stopped echoing. In other cases, especially those involving sexual crimes or accusations of perversion, the pear was used elsewhere, inserted into the body, opened in the dark, turned until tissue tore and nerves failed. The damage was not always visible afterward. That was part of its horror. It left no grand wounds, no gallows spectacle, just internal ruin, shame disguised as silence. A body that still looked intact, but no longer trusted itself. Even if the device was not used as often as legend claims, its reputation was enough. The mere threat of it could draw a confession. The sight of it placed on a table beside other tools could bring a suspect to their knees. It did not need to be turned. It only needed to be present, to sit quietly like a clenched fist, waiting. There is something particularly cruel in the pear's intimacy. Torture devices are usually large, external, overwhelming. The rack stretches the limbs, the wheel breaks the bones. The pyre consumes the body in flame, but the pear enters softly, quietly, and works from within. It knows the body is hollow in places. That silence can be forced. That pain can bloom in the dark. And that is where the name gains its weight. Not just a pear for its shape, but for its slow, expanding bloom. Not a fruit of sweetness, but of anguish. A flower made of iron that never wilts. A punishment for speaking, or perhaps for being heard. Whether it was real or imagined, used frequently or only feared, the pear of anguish reminds us of a truth that runs throughout the medieval world. That control was never only about chains and fire. It was about presence, about fear made physical, about tools that did not need to be used often to leave a mark on the world. Some museums still display replicas of the device. Tourists look at them through glass. Some laugh nervously. Some recoil. Some read the placard and imagine what it would be like to open one, just a little, just enough to feel its purpose. But the truth of the pear is not in the iron. It is in the silence it demanded, in the words never spoken again, in the voice that was taken, piece by piece, petal by petal, until nothing remained but the echo. The breaking wheel was not designed to kill quickly. That was never its purpose. It was built to prolong, to draw out pain with a precision that turned suffering into ritual. In a time when punishment was both a warning and a spectacle, the wheel stood high above all other tools, both in structure and intention. It was large, made of heavy wood, sometimes the size of a cartwheel, sometimes even bigger. It could be mounted vertically like a display or laid flat upon the ground, depending on the region and the sentence. But no matter its position, the goal remained the same: to destroy the body with method and care, and to do so in a way that left no doubt about guilt, judgment, or power. Those sentenced to the wheel were most often condemned for serious crimes: murder, robbery, rebellion, heresy. But what defined the severity was not always the act itself, but the need to make an example. The wheel was not for secret justice, it was for crowds, for the village, for children to remember and men to repeat in hushed tones over firelight. A man stretched across the spokes of the wheel, limbs spread and tied, did not scream alone. He screamed for everyone. His pain was not his own. It was shared, forced upon the minds of those who watched, so that it would shape their obedience long after the blood had dried. The process of breaking began with the limbs. The executioner, often a man chosen for his strength and endurance, would take an iron bar or hammer and begin striking the legs and arms at precise points. Not randomly, not wildly. There was a method. Each blow meant to fracture the bone without severing it completely. The joints were targeted, the long bones of the arms and legs. The goal was to bend the body in unnatural directions, to twist it into a shape that no longer resembled a man, yet still held the faint breath of life. The pain was total. The body responded with spasms, with cries, with the desperate silence that comes only when sound can no longer carry the weight of what is being felt. Some victims lost consciousness early, their minds retreating from what they could not endure. Others remained aware, forced to watch as their own limbs turned against them, bent backwards, twisted like wet cloth. It was not only the breaking that caused pain, but the position that followed. The broken man was often threaded into the wheel itself, his limbs woven between the spokes, his body draped like a puppet caught in a trap. And there he remained, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. In certain executions, death did not come from the blows, but from exposure. The sun, the rain, the birds. A body left on the wheel became more than a warning. It became a landmark. Travelers passed it on the road and crossed themselves. Locals avoided its shadow. Children dared each other to look at it. The man became less than flesh. He became memory, and memory, in those times, was the true sentence. The wheel was not always mounted. In some cases, the condemned was tied to the ground, and the wheel itself was rolled over their body, crushing bones beneath its weight. In others, the wheel was used to strike, held like a weapon by the executioner, its edge turned into a tool of bludgeoning. Each variation had its own name, its own place in the laws of different kingdoms. But the essence remained: destruction without swift release, pain drawn long and thin, like smoke over cold fields. There are stories of men who survived the breaking, not for long, but long enough to speak. In some rare cases, survivors were shown mercy and executed quickly once the sentence had been carried out. A final blow to the chest, to the head, to silence what had already been ruined. But others were left to linger. There are records of men praying aloud with broken mouths, asking forgiveness not from the law, but from their gods, their families, their victims. Some spoke in tongues. Some said nothing at all, choosing death in silence. These moments, fleeting and fragile, are what gave the wheel its terrible reputation. Not just that it broke the body, but that it sometimes left the spirit still intact, watching, feeling, trapped inside the ruin. In France, it was called the roué. In Germany, das Rad. In the Low Countries and parts of Scandinavia, it went by similar names, but across languages, the wheel carried the same meaning: finality through pain, a sentence too large for a noose or a blade, and always it required a crowd. The punishment meant nothing without witnesses. It was the watching that gave the act its power. Executioners were trained in the art of the wheel. They were not simply brutes. They had to understand anatomy, rhythm, endurance. A poorly delivered breaking could end life too soon, cheat the crowd, ruin the spectacle. A well-executed punishment could last for hours. The executioner would rest between blows, walk the circle of the wheel, raise the iron and wait for silence before letting it fall. Each crack of bone was a line in a sermon, a chapter in a story the town would tell for years. Some condemned men were granted final words, a prayer, a confession, a denial. Others were gagged, silenced before they could speak. Not every voice was welcome in the presence of pain. Some executions began with forgiveness, others with curses, but in the end, the wheel drowned them all. Its creak, its thud, the wet sound of flesh meeting wood. These were the sounds that carried through the air, louder than any final breath. In time, the use of the wheel faded. Enlightenment thinkers questioned its purpose. Laws were rewritten. Executions moved from the field to the block, from agony to efficiency. But the memory of the wheel remained. It entered art and poetry, legend and nightmare. Not because it was the most effective form of justice, but because it was the most unforgettable. It did not kill the fastest. It did not leave the cleanest body, but it spoke the loudest. It said, "This is what happens to those who betray, who disobey, who threaten the order we have built." And even now, centuries later, the image of the wheel lingers. A man spread wide, broken in pieces, body twisted like rope, a crowd holding its breath, a silence deeper than death. The wheel reminds us that justice, when left unchecked, can become theater. That pain, when ritualized, can take on a life of its own. And that the human body, even at its most shattered, can still hold something that refuses to surrender. Something not quite broken. Something that watches the sky one last time before the world fades into darkness. It begins not with blood, but with wood. A wheel, broad and solid, not unlike the ones used to carry goods through muddy village streets. It lies at the center of a clearing or mounted high on a post, waiting. It looks simple, familiar even, but it is not meant for transport. It is not meant to move anything from one place to another. Its purpose is stillness. Stillness and pain. For the condemned, the wheel was not just a device of execution. It was a sentence written across every bone in the body. The accused is brought forward, already stripped of dignity. Arms and legs spread wide, tied carefully so the limbs cannot curl or shield. Sometimes they are lashed to the wheel itself. Sometimes they are laid out beside it on a scaffold of planks. The executioner stands ready, holding a heavy iron bar or wooden mallet. He has done this before. He knows exactly where to begin. The first strike does not kill. That is the point. The bar comes down hard on the shin, breaking the bone beneath the skin. Not enough to tear through, just enough to shatter. The sound is sharp, final. The crowd flinches. The victim does not cry out immediately. That comes after the second strike, or the third. Then comes the arm, the thigh, the forearm, the other leg. Blow by blow, each carefully spaced to avoid vital organs, to keep the person alive, alive enough to feel everything, to understand what is happening. There is a rhythm to it, a method. The executioner is not in a hurry. He waits between strikes, watches for the twitch of a finger, the turn of the head, the movement of a chest trying to breathe through agony. He paces, the crowd watches, some turn away. Some stare without blinking. A few look for signs of repentance in the victim's face. Others look only at the blood. The wheel is not just a punishment, it is a performance. When the breaking is done, the body is no longer straight. Limbs are bent in unnatural angles, curled and twisted like broken branches. In some cases, the shattered limbs are woven through the spokes of the wheel. The person is lifted and mounted on a post, the wheel fixed in place high above the ground. This is when death begins its long approach. The wind picks up, the birds begin to gather, the flies come quickly. Hours pass, sometimes a day, sometimes two. A body on the wheel becomes less a man and more a warning. For the condemned, the agony is not only physical, it is also the knowledge of what they have become. Not a person anymore, but a shape hung up for others to see. The wheel becomes a scaffold, a display case, a sentence that extends beyond breath. Some victims begged for a final blow to the chest, a mercy stroke that would end it. Some received it, others did not. Their punishment was to remain until the body gave out on its own, slowly, painfully, under sun and rain and silence. In many towns, the wheel became part of the landscape. People passed it on the way to market, to church, to home. Children were told stories about the man who had defied the law and ended up stretched across the sky. The sight of the body, slowly decaying, reinforced a lesson deeper than any sermon. This is what happens when you cross the boundary of order. This is what justice looks like when it wants to be remembered. The wheel was not used for every crime. It was reserved for the worst. Murderers, traitors, bandits who killed their victims, those whose offenses threatened not just individuals, but the structure of society. The breaking wheel was, for examples, for public memory. And it worked. People feared it more than the gallows, more than the sword. Death was certain either way. It was the journey that frightened them. Not all wheels were the same. Some were designed to crush. Others were used more symbolically, with the execution taking place first and the body broken afterward as a form of display. But the meaning remained. The wheel turned people into lessons. Even after the flesh had fallen away, the bones could remain, bleached and stiff, tangled in the spokes for seasons. In some places, they were left until the wind and birds had taken everything. Executioners who carried out wheel punishments were both feared and respected. Their job required precision, patience, and a steady arm. They had to know how to break without killing, how to pace the blows, how to read the signs of fading consciousness. They were paid well but kept at a distance. They did what others could not, and in doing so, reminded everyone how thin the line was between power and suffering. Some accounts tell of victims who survived the breaking, men who lived for days, whispering prayers or curses through broken teeth. Their endurance became legend. Some were said to smile through the pain. Others spoke to the crowd, even as their lungs struggled to expand. These stories, whether true or embellished, added another layer to the wheel's legacy. It was not only a tool of destruction, it was a place where the spirit was tested. Some believed it could not be broken, even when the body had lost its shape. The church often watched these punishments from the side. Some priests prayed for the dying, others preached to the crowd about justice and repentance. The wheel fit neatly into the theology of suffering. Pain as penance, brokenness as proof of sin, the body destroyed so the soul might be saved. Whether the crowd believed this or not, they listened. The wheel was not just a sentence, it was a sermon. In the end, the wheel faded, not because it lost its power, but because its power became too much. As laws evolved, as governments sought to appear more civilized, the open display of agony became a liability. Executions moved indoors. Torture became more hidden. The wheel, once central, was dismantled, forgotten, or left to rot in empty courtyards. But the memory remained. In stories, in paintings, in the nightmares passed from one generation to the next. The wheel teaches us something about the nature of punishment. That pain, when shaped by law and belief, can become spectacle. That justice, when stretched too far, begins to look like vengeance. That a society's desire to control can turn suffering into a symbol so large it casts a shadow over the living. And yet, for all its horror, there were moments when the wheel failed to do what it intended. Moments when the body broke, but the voice did not. When the crowd saw not a criminal, but a person still holding on. And in that space between agony and silence, something human remained. Something the wheel could not crush. Not with all its weight. Not with all its history. Not even with time. There is a silence in the dungeon that is unlike any silence above the ground. It is not the silence of peace or rest, but of stillness made heavy with time. The walls do not echo in the way stone halls do. They absorb. Moisture clings to the air, thick and sour. Mold grows where no light falls. The stones are slick and uneven beneath bare feet, and the chill never fades, not even in summer. A dungeon is not a place built for moments. It is a place built to hold a person for months, for years, or until nothing remains of them but memory. To be sentenced to the dungeon was to be forgotten in slow motion. There were no clocks, no windows, no reliable way to measure time. A man might count the drips of water from the ceiling or scratch lines into the wall with a broken fingernail, but even those efforts would blur and fade. Meals, if they came at all, arrived without pattern. Sometimes bread soaked in broth, sometimes nothing. Sometimes food was thrown just far enough that the prisoner had to crawl for it, using limbs that ached with cold and strain. Hunger became a constant companion. Not starvation at first, but a gnawing absence that dulled the mind and made every movement a negotiation. Darkness ruled the space. In some cells, prisoners were kept in pitch black, with no flame, no window, no glimpse of sky. Eyes adjusted at first, seeking patterns in the shadows. Then they stopped adjusting. The mind began to see things that were not there. Faces in the stone. Shapes shifting in corners. A glint that suggested light but led nowhere. And if a torch or candle was brought, the light felt foreign, painful even, too sharp for eyes that had forgotten brightness. The floor was often dirt or stone. The bedding, if it existed, was straw soaked through with old urine and rot. Rats came freely, bold and unafraid. Lice bred in the seams of clothing that could not be changed. Skin split from cold, fingers cracked, sores opened, wounds did not heal. They festered. The body adapted in cruel ways. Movement slowed. Nails thickened. Teeth loosened. Breathing grew shallow, both from the damp and from the weight of air that never shifted. But perhaps the most damaging part of the dungeon was not the hunger or cold. It was the waiting, the not knowing. A man could endure pain if he believed it had an end. But in the dungeon, there was no timeline, no trial date, no sentence to be fulfilled. Time became a circle, or worse, a void. Some prayed. Others whispered to themselves. A few sang until their voices cracked. Many simply went silent and never spoke again. Interrogations did not always come with routine. A prisoner might be dragged from sleep and taken to a chamber above, questioned or tortured or left to stand for hours with hands bound. Then returned, with no explanation, no comment. Days might pass, or weeks. Some learned to hope for the questioning, just to hear a voice again, even if it came with pain. Others feared it more than the dark, the idea that they might break, that they might confess to things they never did, that they might say names, real or imagined, just to stop the next blow. There are stories of prisoners who survived years in the dungeon. They came out changed, not only in body, but in mind. Eyes that could not handle daylight, skin that flinched at every touch, voices that rasped like wind over stone. Some were pardoned, some were exchanged. A few were simply released one day without reason. They walked back into a world that no longer remembered them, carrying the silence of their cell in every step. Others never came out. Their bones were found later, curled into corners. Some cells had no drainage, and prisoners drowned during floods or heavy storms. Others were walled in completely, a punishment so final that even the jailers spoke of it in low tones. The idea of being sealed away, with no sound but your own heartbeat, was enough to shake even those who believed in harsh justice. Not every punishment needed iron. Sometimes stone was enough. The dungeon was not only for the guilty. Debt could land a man in chains. Politics could turn a noble into a prisoner overnight. Jealousy, fear, accusation, without proof. All had the power to bring someone beneath the castle or court or monastery to where the light never reached. Some dungeons were small, no more than a pit carved into earth. Others stretched like mazes beneath great halls, with cells stacked one beside the other, thin slits in the walls to pass food or peer at a prisoner who might not move for days. In certain places, isolation was used as a method of punishment all its own. A man placed in a cell with no human contact would begin to unravel. His own voice became strange to him. Thoughts circled without end. Memories twisted and took on new shapes. Faces of loved ones blurred, faded, vanished. Language drifted. In time, some forgot their own names. They did not resist because they no longer remembered what they were resisting. They simply became part of the stone. The guards who worked the dungeons were not always cruel. Some grew numb. Others pitied the prisoners but said nothing. They brought food, changed water, swept filth from the floors with quick hands and eyes turned away. They heard the cries, the songs, the silence. They learned to measure a man's time not in years, but in how often he begged to die. And they knew that some, when released, would never speak of what had happened, either out of fear or shame or simply because the words no longer made sense. The dungeon was a sentence that did not always come with law. It was not about crime, but control. Not about guilt, but disappearance. It was the tool of kings and lords and inquisitors, of councils that feared unrest and rulers who feared betrayal. It was cheaper than war and quieter than execution. A man in a cell caused no revolt. A body buried beneath the castle raised no protest. Only sometimes, when the wind shifted, could you smell the truth beneath the stones. To rot in the dungeon was not just to be punished, it was to be erased, slowly, deliberately, without fire, without rope, without spectacle, just time and stone and silence. The world continued above. Bells rang, markets bustled, sermons were preached, children played, and beneath it all, in the dark corners no one wanted to remember, someone waited. Not for freedom, not for justice, just for an end. Any end at all. In the medieval world, fire was not only a destroyer, it was a craftsman. It shaped tools, cooked meals, forged weapons. It brought light and warmth to cold stone rooms. But fire also punished. It taught, it reminded. In the hands of a torturer, fire became a careful tool, not wild and consuming like the blaze of execution, but slow, direct, and personal. It could be controlled, aimed, moderated. A single coal could do what a sword could not. It could leave a man alive, marked, and made an example. The pain of fire does not begin with the flame. It begins with the anticipation, the heat on the skin before contact, the smell of burning wood or oil in the air, the hiss of metal being heated until it glows. A man might be tied to a chair or chained to the wall, watching as a blacksmith's tools are placed into the brazier one by one. The weight is part of the punishment. Time stretches, sweat gathers. The body already begins to feel the pain before the iron ever touches flesh. Branding was among the most common uses of fire in punishment. A letter, carved in reverse into iron, was heated until red and pressed to the skin. A thief might be marked with a T, a runaway serf with a symbol of ownership, a blasphemer with a cross. The brand was placed on the cheek, the shoulder, the hand, somewhere visible, somewhere permanent. It hurt, of course. The sizzle of skin, the sudden white flash of pain, the shock of nerves beneath the surface. But the pain faded. The mark remained. That was its purpose. To be branded was to carry the memory of your crime forever, not just for others to see, but for you to remember. You could not hide it. You could not deny it. It became part of the body, part of your shape. Some tried to cover their brands with cloth or dirt. Others dug at them with knives or burned themselves again to blur the shape. But even scars told stories. A healed brand was still a mark, still a sentence, still a message. Other uses of fire were more direct. Heated tongs were applied to flesh, used to tear or burn. Coals were placed beneath feet or under the back. Skin blistered slowly, painfully. Muscles clenched. The body jerked without control. Sometimes the fire was used during interrogation. A man might be asked a question, and if he refused to answer, the iron was touched to his skin, not deeply. Not enough to kill, just enough to change his mind, or to test it. One of the most feared devices was the iron shoe. It was a kind of metal boot, rigid and heavy, placed over the foot and sealed tightly. Sometimes it was empty. Other times it was filled with oil or water. Once the shoe was on, it was heated from the outside. Slowly, deliberately. The metal expanded, the heat spread. At first, the foot would sweat. Then the skin would redden. Then the flesh would begin to cook inside the shoe, the pain rising through the leg and into the spine. The victim could not remove it, could not move, could only scream or bite down or faint. Iron shoes were not always used to extract confessions. Sometimes they were the punishment itself, for soldiers who deserted, for spies who were caught, for enemies who needed to be broken. The foot is a sensitive place. It holds balance, movement, freedom. To destroy it was to change a man permanently. Even if he survived, he would not run again. He would not walk without a limp. The fire worked its craft from the toes upward, until the very idea of standing became memory. In some cases, hot metal was poured, not onto the body, but near it, into the ears, into the mouth, down the back. It was rare, but it happened, usually reserved for those considered enemies of the faith or traitors to the crown. The act was symbolic as much as physical. Pouring molten lead into the ear was not just to destroy. It was to block sound, to silence truth. A final punishment for those who listened to heresy or spread it. The precision of fire made it a favorite among those who wanted to control pain rather than unleash it. Unlike the axe or the noose, fire could be modulated. A red-hot needle applied just for a moment. A coal pressed to the palm for seconds. The burn could be shallow or deep. A tool of teaching or of final punishment. It was versatile, and it obeyed. Those who used fire for punishment often learned their trade from blacksmiths or executioners. They understood the heat, the timing, the texture of metal at different temperatures. Fire is not cruel by itself. It has no intent. It is the hand that holds it that shapes what it becomes. And in medieval dungeons and chambers, that hand was trained, steady, and relentless. Sometimes fire was used not to injure, but to threaten. A torch held close to the face, a poker laid across the knees without touching. The glow of an iron rod waved in front of the eyes. These acts often broke the will before pain was needed. The mind feared fire deeply, more than the whip, more than the blade, because fire lingers, it changes the skin, it steals identity. It turns a hand into a memory, a face into a warning. Even after the punishment ended, the smell of it stayed. Burnt hair, singed flesh, smoke on the skin. Some prisoners said it followed them for weeks. Some said they could smell it forever. As if the fire had not only touched their body but entered it, lived in it, waited in their bones. In time, as laws changed and punishments became less visible, the use of fire diminished. Branding faded. Interrogation shifted to other methods, but fire had done its work. It left its marks, not just on skin, but on culture, on memory, on the stories people told about justice and sin. Fire, in the end, does not forget. It builds and it breaks, it shapes and it scars. In the hands of a craftsman, it became an extension of judgment, a tool with no mercy, a flicker of light in the dark that promised pain, and then delivered, quietly, completely, without ever raising its voice. The church did not invent torture, but it shaped it with intention. While kings and lords used pain to enforce power, the church used it to seek something deeper. Not control, but confession. Not obedience, but purity. In theory, at least. In practice, the lines blurred. The goal became not just the soul's salvation, but the preservation of doctrine, the rooting out of error, the silencing of challenge. Suffering was not merely punishment, it was purification. The body could be harmed, the voice could be broken, as long as the truth came forth. The truth, in this case, being what the church already believed to be true. The Inquisition became the most formalized version of this pursuit. It began quietly, as a tool to investigate heresy. At first, it relied on questioning, community reports, whispers. But soon, that was not enough. Heresy did not always confess itself. It hid, it whispered, it wore the face of piety while corrupting from within. So the church turned to pain, not out of cruelty, the records claimed, but out of necessity. To save the soul, the truth had to be exposed. And if a man would not give it freely, then suffering would strip it from him. Interrogations began with prayer. Priests stood nearby. Inquisitors offered the accused a chance to speak, to unburden themselves. If they refused, the questioning deepened. Devices were brought forward. The rack, the pulley, the boot. No blood was to be drawn, officially. The flesh was to remain unbroken. But within that boundary, much was allowed. Dislocation, suffocation, crushing. Pain that bruised the soul but did not spill the body's contents. That was the rule. Or so they said. Many victims were not given clear charges. They were told only that they were suspected of error, of deviation. Vague accusations meant that any confession could be accepted. A wrong word, a different prayer, a question asked in the wrong company. These could all be signs of heresy, and once the process began, silence was not safety. Silence was guilt. Only confession could lead to mercy. Some accused were told they would be shown the tools, but not harmed. The sight of them was supposed to stir fear, and sometimes it worked. Others were bound and suspended by the arms, weights tied to their feet. Some were forced to remain awake for days, under threat of worse. The questions came again and again. The same phrases, repeated until the mind unraveled. Are you guilty? Who else? What did you say? Where did you learn it? Confessions given under torture were not always accepted immediately. The accused might be required to repeat them later, in public, without pain. If they refused, the process resumed. The logic twisted itself. If a man confessed under suffering and then retracted it in calm, he was lying again. If he confessed in calm and then denied under torture, he was resisting the truth. The path out became narrow, often invisible. Women were not spared. In some regions, they were accused more frequently than men, especially if they were midwives, herbalists, or widows. Knowledge was suspect. Solitude was suspect. Dreams, visions, or unexplained kindness could all become evidence. Torture was often quieter for women, but no less cruel. Devices used were tailored to avoid scandal, but the pain they delivered was precise. The church believed it was acting in mercy. Better to suffer now and confess than to die in heresy and burn forever. This belief gave the inquisitors a kind of peace. They did not see themselves as executioners, but as shepherds with sharp tools. Their victims were sheep straying from the fold, and the pain was the crook pulling them back. There were limits, on paper. Torture could not be repeated. But this rule bent easily. If a session was paused, it could be resumed. If a new charge was added, a new round could begin. The boundaries blurred. Pain became routine. Records show sessions lasting hours. Men who passed out and were revived to continue. Women who screamed until their voices vanished. And when the confession came, it was written down, signed, and used to justify the next. Not all priests approved. Some wrote in secret about the cruelty they witnessed. Some begged for restraint. Others believed deeply, praying as the wheel turned, chanting psalms as the ropes tightened. They asked for God's guidance, even as the cries filled the chamber. Faith and pain became partners, a strange communion. Those who confessed were offered penance, public humiliation, pilgrimage, imprisonment, a second chance. But not all were spared. Some were burned anyway. Their confession accepted, but their danger judged too great. The fire became the final purging, cleansing not only the soul, but the memory. Even the innocent were changed. If they survived, they walked away different. Their faith shaken or reshaped. Their families altered. Their names marked. Some found peace in silence. Others never stopped speaking, warning, pleading. A few became fanatics, repeating the words they had been forced to say, believing them at last, or pretending to. The line between belief and survival grew thin. The church eventually revised its stance. Torture fell out of favor. New voices rose, arguing for reason, for conscience. But the memory remained. It lingers in the margins of dusty manuscripts, in the quiet rooms of old monasteries, in stories passed from mother to daughter. The confession drawn through suffering is not easily forgotten. Pain, once used as a path to truth, became a lesson in silence, and the church, in all its candlelit glory, learned too late that a soul forced to speak is not the same as a soul that believes. But by then, the tools were worn smooth, the prayers memorized, the records sealed, and those who had screamed into the dark had long since faded into stone. It did not begin in silence. It began with a crowd. In the square, near the gallows or just outside the city gates, people gathered early. Children sat on shoulders. Vendors pushed carts of hot bread and boiled meat. Friends claimed spots with good views. There was laughter, arguing, coins changing hands. It felt like a market day or a village fair. And in many ways, it was. But this was not a celebration of the harvest or a saint's feast. It was an execution, a death in public, a performance with only one ending, and everyone knew what it would be. In the Middle Ages, executions were more than punishment. They were ritual, a stage play of justice where the crime was recalled, the sentence declared, and the body displayed. The condemned became the centerpiece of a civic event, one last use to be made of a human life before it was extinguished. Some cities had permanent scaffolds, others built them fresh each time. In every case, the setting mattered. It had to be visible, elevated, unforgettable. On the morning of the execution, the prisoner was prepared, sometimes bathed, sometimes shaved, sometimes forced to wear a sign or symbol of their crime. The walk to the scaffold was often slow. Guards flanked the condemned. A priest walked beside, offering last rites or urging repentance. The crowd parted and closed again, whispering or jeering or praying. It depended on who the person was and what they had done. A thief might be mocked. A nobleman might be watched in silence. A woman accused of sorcery might hear both curses and tears. The method of execution varied by region and offense. Hanging was common. The condemned stood on a platform or a cart. The rope was adjusted, tested, then placed around the neck. The cart rolled forward, or the floor dropped. If the knot was tied poorly, the fall did not break the neck. The body danced, legs kicking, arms twitching. That was part of the risk. The crowd watched every movement, every moment. Beheading was used for more serious crimes or for those of higher status. It was seen as cleaner, more honorable. A single stroke from a sharp blade, if done well. But not every executioner was skilled. Sometimes it took 2 swings, 3. The first strike might catch the shoulder. The second strike might only deepen the wound. Blood sprayed, heads rolled, and the spectators flinched or gasped, but still they watched. It was the duty of the executioner to finish it cleanly. It was the duty of the people to bear witness. Burning was reserved for heretics, witches, and those deemed dangerous to the soul of the community. A pyre was built high and wide. The condemned was tied to a post or set upon a platform. Fire was lit at the base and smoke curled upward. Some were strangled first, others burned alive. Flames climbed slowly, eating cloth, then flesh. The screams rose with them. People in the crowd covered their faces or crossed themselves or shouted praise to God. The fire cracked and hissed, the air filled with the scent of ash and fat. No one left early. Drawing and quartering was among the most brutal. Used for traitors and rebels, it began with hanging, then disembowelment while still alive, then beheading, then the body pulled apart by horses or cleaved into pieces. These parts were sent to corners of the realm, hung on gates, nailed to bridges, a message in flesh. It took time. The executioner worked with care. The crowd stayed. Children were not kept away. They stood near the front or perched on crates. They watched. They learned. This was the world they would grow into. Death was not hidden from them. It was presented as lesson and warning. Their parents explained what the condemned had done, why this punishment was deserved, how the law worked. The execution was education. Vendors sold food and drink. Musicians sometimes played. A juggler might perform before the execution began. Storytellers might recount the crime with flair. The line between justice and theater blurred. There was no curtain, no intermission, just the body, the moment, and the crowd. For the condemned, the final hour was both agony and performance. Some wept, some screamed, some cursed the judges or the crowd. Others prayed, lips moving fast and low. A few forgave. There are records of prisoners delivering speeches, long and poetic, hoping to be remembered not for their crime but for their courage. Some sang hymns, some stayed silent. In those moments, a person became more than a name. They became a symbol. What they said, or did not say, echoed beyond the scaffold. Executioners were both feared and needed. They lived apart, avoided by many, paid by the state. Their job required strength and nerve, precision and speed. They trained. They learned where to strike, when to pause, how to end a life without panic. Some were hated, others respected. A few became famous for their skill. They cleaned their tools, sharpened their blades, prepared their fires. Their work was essential to the theater of death. Public executions served many purposes. They punished the guilty, displayed the power of the state, reinforced the law, fed the hunger for justice or revenge. But they also provided something else, a shared experience, a reminder of mortality, a glimpse at what waited on the other side of crime. The crowd went home afterward. They talked about what they saw. They retold the story. Some slept uneasily, some dreamed of blood, some forgot quickly. The scaffold was taken down, the ashes swept. The square returned to its usual rhythm, but the image remained. The rope swinging in the wind, the empty post, the sound of the axe, the look in the condemned's eyes. These were memories carried in silence, until the next time. Eventually, executions moved indoors or became less public. Tastes changed, laws evolved, but for centuries, Death was something to be seen, not hidden, not whispered. Seen in full daylight, with all its weight and noise and finality. Execution was not just a tool, it was a ritual, a gathering, a reminder. And it told every man, woman, and child who watched, this is the price, this is the line, this is how it ends. It is easy to imagine medieval torture as something done in secret, far from the reach of law, a shadowy thing, quiet, unlawful, but that was rarely the case. In much of Europe, especially after the 12th century, torture became not just permitted but written into the very fabric of legal codes. It was formal, organized, regulated. In some cases, it was even expected, not because people were monsters, but because they believed pain had a purpose. They believed the body could reveal the truth if questioned in the right way. And they believed the law had the right to ask. It started with Roman law. Centuries before the Middle Ages, the Roman legal system had developed a practice called quaestio per tormenta, or inquiry through torment. Slaves could be tortured to verify a testimony. Confessions could be drawn out by force if the crime was grave enough. The idea was not chaos, it was procedure. Controlled pain applied to extract a truth that otherwise might remain hidden. That belief did not disappear when Rome fell. It simply adapted. By the High Middle Ages, especially under the influence of the rediscovered Roman legal texts like the Corpus Juris Civilis, torture was stitched into the process of criminal investigation. Cities across Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, and later France and Spain began to formalize its use. Torture could not be used on a whim. It required approval. A judge had to authorize it. Witnesses had to be presented, the crime had to be serious, and the suspect had to be half-proven, guilty already. In other words, suspicion alone was not enough. There had to be a foundation. Torture was used to finish what the evidence had started. This half-proof was often based on circumstantial evidence or the testimony of others. It was shaky ground, but it allowed a judge to move forward. Torture was then seen as a necessary step, a bridge between uncertainty and justice. The suspect would be warned first, given a chance to confess freely. If they remained silent or denied the charges, then the tools would be brought forward. The ropes, the rack, the vice, the threat was often enough, but if not, the real work began. There were limits, at least on paper. A person could not be tortured to the point of death or permanent injury. A confession extracted under pain had to be confirmed afterward, once the subject had recovered. If they recanted, the process could begin again. The law pretended at mercy, but in truth, it granted wide power. A judge could call for repeated sessions, could order more intense methods, could claim a retraction was the result of fear, not truth. Torture became not a last resort, but a standard tool. Courts in Germany, for instance, maintained detailed records of torture sessions. How long they lasted, what devices were used, what was said. Inquisitorial systems like those of the Spanish Inquisition kept even more precise logs. Pain was paperwork. Blood was evidence. Screams were part of the script. Even the Church, which sometimes condemned torture in theory, found ways to allow it in practice. Heresy was seen as a poison in the body of Christendom. To root it out, pain was justified. Confessions of heresy were required to save the soul. In this way, the law and the faith walked hand in hand, each justifying the other. Torture was not always about obtaining a confession. Sometimes it was used to identify accomplices. A prisoner would be asked to name others, to accuse their friends or family. If they refused, the pressure increased. If they complied, those named could be tortured in turn. The cycle expanded outward, like ripples in water, pulling more people into the pit. There were manuals for all this. Legal handbooks, like the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina in the Holy Roman Empire, spelled out exactly how and when torture could be used. Judges were trained in its principles. They learned when to stop, how to phrase the questions, how to record the answers. It was not chaos. It was a system. In some towns, professional torturers were employed by the court. Their job was not just to inflict pain, but to do so with precision. They knew how far a body could bend, how long a man could hang by his wrists, how tightly to turn the screws before bone began to crack. Their work was clinical, often silent. They were not angry. They were not wild. They were exact. For those subjected to this system, the legal protections offered little comfort. A man accused of theft or heresy might face the rack whether he was guilty or not. The law assumed guilt and demanded the body prove otherwise. There was no presumption of innocence, no right to silence, no lawyer to intervene. The court and the torturer spoke as one. Children were not exempt, nor were women. Pregnant women might be spared until after birth, but not always. Age, status, and health might be considered, but only slightly. Once suspicion took hold, the machinery moved forward. And still, many believed it was right. The law was not meant to be gentle. It was meant to maintain order, to protect the soul, to guard the community. Pain was its language. The screams of the accused were seen as necessary sounds, not pleasant, not joyful, but proper. The world, after all, was a place of suffering. What was a little more, if it brought truth to light? Over time, skepticism grew. Thinkers began to question whether pain really led to truth, whether a man would not say anything just to make it stop, whether justice based on screams could be trusted. By the 17th and 18th centuries, torture began to fade from law. Philosophers, reformers, and lawyers pushed back. New codes were written. New ideas took hold. But for centuries, torture was not beneath the law. It was the law. Not a crime, but a method. Not hidden, but written. Ink and iron working together. A page turned in court. A lever pulled in the dungeon, and justice, as it was understood, marched forward on bones and bruises. Thank you for staying with me through this long, heavy journey into one of the darkest chambers of the past. I know this wasn't easy. Not every story from history is comforting. Not every fact is something we want to picture clearly. But that, in some way, is exactly the point. The stories we hide are often the ones that need remembering the most. Not to glorify them, not to dwell in cruelty, but to understand the roads we walked, and how far we've come, or in some ways, how far we still have to go. When we think of medieval torture, it's tempting to see it as distant, foreign, a world of monsters and madmen. But the truth is colder than that. These acts were carried out by ordinary people, craftsmen, clerks, priests, judges. They followed rules. They wrote reports. They used pain like ink, and blood like a stamp of approval. This wasn't chaos. It was structure. And that structure tells us something about the world we built back then. In those dim stone rooms beneath castles and courts, the dungeon was not a place for silence. It was a place for screams, for confessions, for orders barked and obeyed. But now, centuries later, all that remains is the quiet. The echoes have softened, the tools have rusted. The laws that justified the pain have been replaced by others, ones that promise justice of a different kind, and yet the memory remains. The rack, the pear, the wheel, the flame. These things were not invented to be forgotten. They were created with purpose, and that purpose has left its mark on the human story. We might want to turn away from it, but history has a way of catching our sleeve as we pass, whispering not to forget. You might ask, what does it mean now? What use is it to study pain so old, so distant, so buried? I would say it teaches us the weight of power, the cost of belief, the ease with which good intentions can harden into cruelty when no one is watching closely enough. We are always writing laws, always building systems. It's worth remembering how often those systems, in the name of order or faith or justice, turned to tools that broke bodies instead of listening to them. And so, as we leave this dungeon behind, let's carry something with us that's a little quieter than pain. A question. A sense of caution. A reminder that every age thinks it is right. That every generation swears it knows what truth looks like. That every system believes it serves the people. And sometimes, those beliefs leave scars we only recognize centuries later. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. I'm glad you were here. Please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and letting me know in the comments what you thought, what surprised you, or what parts stayed with you. Tell me what city you're watching from, and what time it is right now. I'm always amazed by the global community that finds peace in these slow, strange walks through the past. You all make the effort worth it. And now, as the fire dies and the door creaks shut behind us, let the dungeon rest. Let the chains be still. Let the silence speak for those who were never allowed to. Sleep well. And until next time, keep questioning the stories we inherit. Keep listening for the quiet voices history almost forgot.